Hi, welcome to The Funding Blueprint, Unlocking Startup Success, presented by StartHub. I'm Cody Goff, and today we're doing a deep dive into executive coaching. Would you believe that some VCs won't even work with founders unless they have an executive coach? So yeah, I would say that they're not really a waste of time or money. But how do you find the right one, and how specifically can they help you and your startup? Well, we'll get into all that and more today. Now, this is the final episode of Season 1 of The Funding Blueprint, and my final episode as the host of the show. So today, to introduce my guest for episode 30, I've invited the new host to do the honors, StartHub founder and CEO, Avraham Ilyayev. Avraham?
Thanks, Cody. Today's guest is Maxine Minter. She's the founder and general partner at Ventures and leads Australia's first pre-seed fund and its premier solo female GP-led fund. Maxine also founded Collab, a platform matching startup founders and CEOs with top executive coaches, and co-hosts First Check, a podcast featuring conversations with seasoned investors. Her work bridges the gap between Australian startups and international investors. Maxine operates between San Francisco and Sydney.
Thanks, Avraham. Well said. This podcast is in good hands. Anyway, Collab matches startups with top executive coaches. So to start our conversation, I asked Maxine, what kind of demonstrable value can an executive coach really bring to the table? Here's our conversation.
Yeah, I think it's such a good question, and one that we obviously get from all of the founders and executive teams that we work alongside. So I think the best way to think about executive coaching, and I might actually first distinguish here from advising, because a question that we frequently get from founders and those executive teams is, how do I get the most out of this, and what actually is executive coaching? So I might introduce a framework here to kind of ground our conversation as we're talking about executive coaching, and then talk about why the executive coaching part of that is really, really impactful. So I think of executive coaching along a continuum. On the left-hand side of the executive coaching, you have what I would call intrapersonal work. So how we think about ourselves, how we talk about ourselves, our mental models on things like conflict, interpersonal dynamics, how we operate, how hard we work, all of those kinds of things. On the other end of the continuum, I would think of it as systems level work. And this looks actually a little bit more like management consulting, but in our context, in the startup context. So things like advising on the remuneration structures and kind of interpersonal structures that we have in the organization. It might be kind of team structures. It might be for specific areas like your engineering org, etc. And executive coaches operate anywhere along that continuum. As the framework kind of suggests, on the far right-hand side, on that kind of system level work, that starts to look more like advising. So an executive coach can operate anywhere along that continuum. And when you're thinking about working with an executive coach, it's a helpful way to anchor, what kind of work am I looking to do? And the distinction here between a coach and an advisor, a coach's job is to capacitate you, the athlete or the person actually doing the work, to be even better at the thing that they do. Another way to think about it is a coach's job is to accelerate the person that they work for towards the goals that they are working together. Advisory is to show you and tell you how to do it. So the distinction here is kind of how that person is interacting with you. So the place that I find executive coaching in our world to be most impactful is for founders and executives looking to make that acceleration through each of the stages of building the company after they've built the product. So I find executive coaching to be most impactful when you are working with founders and executives who are looking to adjust, say, from founder to CEO. So actually, okay, great, we've started to feel the beginning parts of that product market fit. Now, how do I build and run the company around that product market fit? So that kind of seed through early Series A to Series B stage. Or, how do I think about expanding the product lines, kind of expanding the overall scope of this organization up through growth? So Series B and beyond. Examples of where we do a lot of work with teams are things like how the CEO is thinking about the systems and processes in the organization to ensure that the organization has the right level of scale. A tactical example here that we see with CEOs quite frequently, especially founder CEOs, is two kind of directions that they go in. One direction is, as they are making that transition from founder to CEO, struggling to let go of the day-to-day. So struggling to delegate effectively in a way that gives them leverage on their time. So tactically, what that ends up looking like is they go through a really thoughtful recruitment process. They find this amazing person to come in and say, run their operations. And then they give them a scope of work. And then they seek to be in every single daily detail with that person. 3 months in, 4 months in, they identify this is actually more work. Why is this more work for me to have this person on my team? And what that actually starts to do is generate conflict and frustration and friction between them and that team member because it's not working for them as a system. So what we have there is a CEO kind of staying in the detail and struggling to delegate. So we work on skills both on the structural end and also in the intrapersonal end and interpersonal end on the skills, frameworks, and mindsets that are necessary to get the right level of leverage for that CEO to work effectively with that new executive. The other version of this is we see abdication, which is, again, you hire that amazing COO and you say, excellent, here's the company, best of luck, I'm going to go away and focus back on product. 3 months later, they lean in again because they're starting to see kind of smoke or things not working that well. And they realize that person didn't have the right context. They didn't have the skill sets. They didn't know necessarily what they were doing, or they didn't have the right permission to be going chasing, whatever it is that they wanted to change. And then the CEO has to dive all the way back into the detail again. It generates interpersonal conflict. It generates frustration, etc. Because what has happened is that that CEO hasn't delegated effectively to their executive team. Now, you can imagine what happens if we bring on multiple of those people at any one time, the complexity and system challenges that occur in the organization. So that's something we work on with CEOs and C-suite frequently.
I'm interested in what happens when, do startup founders ever come to you and say, well, I think I need an executive coach, but then you turn around and you say, no, you really need a startup advisor? Because what I'm hearing from you is like, I get all the intrapersonal stuff, but you said that they can do systems level work, right? So is an executive coach a one size fits all, or are there times when you say, no, an advisor is a better option?
Absolutely. It happens relatively frequently. And so I think the flag for us is when someone comes to us, again, because we do matching, right? Our job is to help the founder identify or the executive identify what is it that they're looking to work with an executive coach on. And then we match that to the world's best executive coach for those things. And so sometimes they come to us and they say, hey, I am at the level of scale that I'm really excited to be thinking about kind of people and human resource systems in my organization. What I want from a coach is someone to come in and tell me what to do, which systems to put in place, and exactly how to implement it. And so often that's a flag for us to double click and ask them, okay, and what's your role? How would you like to show up in that process? What is the skill set that you're looking to develop? And if they say to us, actually, that's not where I'm focused, I really want someone to just come in and kind of give me leverage on this knowledge set or skill set, wonderful opportunity for an advisor. Again, that definition of a coach, our job is to accelerate that person towards their goals by helping capacitate them with skill sets, mindsets, kind of system level shifts for them to be an even more effective executive. If what they're looking for is a plug and play set of advice, then excellent opportunity for them to go and engage an advisor or work with someone who's a subject matter expert in that area. Now, I will say, in our opinion, in order to be one of the world's best executive coaches for startup CEOs and executive teams in startups, you really have to deeply understand startups. So we look for executive coaches who have been CEOs multiple times, scaled their own organizations, been investors for years and years, people that have the deep instinct level understanding of startups so that they can bring that expertise to accelerating those CEOs and executive teams.
I'm curious, a lot of people don't know what they don't know, or they think they know what they don't know, and they are wrong. So if an executive comes to you and says, I want a coach, I want to work on this, are there any systems, criteria, methodologies you use to verify that that's actually what they're looking for? Asking questions of their colleagues. I don't know how you even do that. So talk me through how you help them figure out what they actually want.
Yeah, absolutely. So very frequently, founders will come to us and say, hey, I really want to work on these two things. And we have enough experience to know that there's maybe some kind of symptomatic elements that are going here versus cause. And so our matchmakers are all coaches as well. They have kind of deep expertise in the area, so very skilled at asking the right questions to kind of unearth some of those features. The other thing I would name here is to be an effective CEO or to be an effective executive, it's really important that you develop the skill set of being a reliable narrator. And what I mean by that is you do a good job of identifying root cause, and kind of dispassionately assessing the system that you're in. And so a lot of the questions we ask in those conversations are around exploring, what is it that might actually be going on here? Talk to me about the system. Talk to me about what you have in place. Asking questions like, is it possible? Or is it, could there be something else going on? And we do that in the initial investigation, because in order for us to give them what we are seeking to give them, which is the best executive coach to accelerate them towards their goals, it's really important we understand what the path might be to that. Now, the other thing to name is that very frequently we pair executive coaches with founders, CEOs, and executive teams, and the engagement starts off in one place, but actually grows into a new place. So very often we suggest a 360 at the beginning of an engagement to help the information saturation for that coach, to make sure that they are guiding that CEO or that executive to get them to the right place. Now, the other thing is we also support companies on doing 360s and offsites. So they are also additional touch points that the coach can get to help that founder or that CEO kind of deeply understand, oh, interesting, I thought the problem space was here, but I think there's maybe some upstream opportunities to accelerate me to that outcome I'm looking to get. Mostly, my experience has been that those folks that do come to coaching and are seeking coaching are very interested and curious about their development. And so they usually are coming in open to the possibility that there might be some additional kind of peripheral elements that would be helpful on accelerating them to their goals.
It's really interesting. Startups pivot a lot. They adapt, they shift, they evolve. I was going to ask you, how do you adapt these programs to suit that fast-paced, rapidly evolving environment? I'm guessing part of that is that since it is personal development, there's always more to work on. But I guess, what happens if the needs dramatically change and you've matched them with an executive coach with maybe one area of expertise, and do you hand them off to somebody else? Do they stick with them, and do they adapt too? Yeah, how does that kind of work?
Yeah, I think the best comp here is think about executive coaching in startups in the same way that we think about coaching in elite sport or coaching in elite music. What we have here are exceptionally skilled individuals who have a deep reservoir of skills that they're bringing to a coaching engagement, and they're looking for a partner to help them hone and accelerate those skills. So in the same way you would expect with an elite sports person, it's very unusual that they have a single coach from the beginning of their career all the way to the end, because the context in which they're playing, the context in which they are doing their best work actually shifts over time. And so one of the benefits of working with an organization like Collab is you can actually over time adjust your coaching needs by coming back and saying, excellent, I got what I needed out of that. You have the deep context of what I was looking to get in that coaching engagement. And now I can move on, kind of graduate to my next coach. An example of this might be someone who is a seed stage CEO who is just coming out of the beginning of that search for product market fit and wanting to do the kind of growth from, let's say, 25 people to 100 people. The features of that organization mean that you are probably, as a CEO, just starting to put in kind of early executive team function, thinking about early kind of communications across the organization, thinking about kind of early dynamics on how we share feedback, how we have performance review conversations, etc. And so they work very closely with a coach who's deeply experienced in getting CEOs up that curve and implementing systems and processes that work really well in that organization. Also the mindsets, right? There is an element of a hierarchy that develops over that time, getting comfortable with the fact that you are now a CEO, that you have to operate at a certain level of leverage, that every time you choose to dive in and write code, you are also choosing not to analyze and run the organization, things like that. So then when we get to, say, 150 people and we're on the ramp to 500 people, what we're looking to build at that stage is probably a more sophisticated C-suite. thinking about how to run a C-suite with a bunch of folks that are far more experienced than you in a particular vertical. Lots of them are actually older than you. They come from a different era of building than you. And thinking about how to run that team really effectively, how to be the architect of connective tissue across your executive team so that they run operationally asynchronously from you, but still in alignment with the vision and expertise that you want them to be delivering. And so often that kind of inflection point around 150 people, 200, is when we actually start to match them with a second set of coaches who are more focused on that kind of sophistication of organization as opposed to kind of early culture building.
I have so many follow-up questions. I'd love to double click a little bit on the economics of it from a couple different angles. We can start with whichever one you want. Obviously, one is what kind of return on investment in a concrete way, as concrete as possible, have startups you've worked with seen in this? Let's just start there, actually. Then we can go to the other stuff. But how have you quantified, like, here's what that executive coach did for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you can imagine, it really depends on the goals, right? Like if someone is coming to us and asking, I want to get excellent at delegation, that's a much easier economic evaluation than I'm really struggling with imposter syndrome. I'm showing up in these meetings and I'm not having my voice heard. I'm not kind of stating my opinion, et cetera, from that place of imposter syndrome. And so I will say that this kind of economic argument around executive coaching can be challenging because of the time scale of payback. But I think there's some kind of simplifications we can do to help us think through how to think about this scope. And so the first thing that I recommend people do is think about value creation per hour as let's just stick with the CEO founder. So thinking about, okay, if I evaluate, how much value do I create per hour as a startup CEO? For most venture-backed startup CEOs, that's somewhere in the realm of $500 to $1,000 an hour, taking into account kind of future value of the organization. And so if we think of, okay, if I can find a way to make myself, let's say 2 times more efficient by my leverage model, or make my executive team 50% more efficient by the way that we run our executive team meeting, the way that we have feedback conversations, the way that we have performance development conversations, the way that we think about kind of high leverage models within our executive team. It's pretty quickly we can get to, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars of value created in a single year by increasing that leverage model. And so solving backwards, a rule of thumb is I'd look for anywhere between a 5 to 10x ROI over the course of the year if you think about the value created in your overall organization. This is also why I often, when folks come to us looking for executive coaching and they are at the early seed stage, they're kind of deep in the detail, trying to find product market fit with their organization, I nudge them to come back in, slightly later down their stage, because you really only start to get that value from executive coaching of the kind that we do with the caliber of coaches that we work with when you start to be impacting an entire system as an executive. If it's you and 4 people in an organization, you probably yet don't have the leverage in your organization that has the payback period that looks like that 5 to 10x. So you ask there for kind of a tactical evaluation. Let's say you are paying each of your executives, you're a late Series A organization, you have 3 C-suites, you're paying each of them $200,000 a year plus equity. And they are currently, because of the way that you are leading them and the way that you're running the team, they currently have, let's say, 20 to 30% more capacity in the amount that they are able to deliver every year. And so let's say in that first year, you're unlocking $60,000 more value per executive in the way that they're running together. So let's say across the 3 of them, you then have $180K. The right amount to be spending on a coach over the course of that year is about $18,000.
I like that. It's a great way to break down the math. Is there like a value calculator on your website?
That's an interesting question. We don't, because again, it really depends on the engagement, right? We have worked with a lot of executives where imposter syndrome actually is the thing that interrupts their success. In that circumstance, actually, the right coach can be even more value additive, because what I've seen in those circumstances is imposter syndrome, the way it shows up with the way that you interact with investors, the way that you chase, future potential opportunities, the way that you lead your team. You actually are deleveraging yourself in like 3 to 5 different directions and really high impact directions. And so in those circumstances, the evaluation calculator would look much larger than, just unlocking delegation in your executive team, for example. There's also another bucket here that I think it's important to name, but is harder to quantify, which is optimism and motivation in your executive team. There is lots of research to show that partnering with the right executive coach sees marked increase in motivation and optimism for the executives that are working with those coaches. That's much harder to quantify, but we see this again and again. And if you think of this line of work in particular, as a startup founder, especially in this macro environment, the level to which you feel optimistic about your ability to execute through this period and bring your team along the journey for that optimism, I think is actually super impactful. Again, difficult to quantify, but I think something to really keep in mind.
Definitely. We have a lot of startup founders are really young, right? Like teens, even in their 20s. So just in case any aren't familiar with imposter syndrome, it's essentially this feeling that even when you're totally qualified to do something, you just don't feel confident that you're able to do it correctly. It's like if I walk into an interview and I'm like, I don't know if I'm going to do okay. Like I've been interviewing people for 20 years. You'd think I would know by now, right? But there's that imposter syndrome. And I used to co-host a podcast for Discovery. We did science studies. My co-host was a woman, Ashley. And I don't remember where the stats were. I couldn't remember if imposter syndrome was a little more common in women or in men. But from your point of view, are you seeing it both? Is there, everybody should think about this, right? It doesn't just fall into the lap of one subset of people.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I see it across our community of founders that we work for and executives that we work for and actually investors. So we do a lot of executive coaching for investors as well. We see it across the board for all of them. What's interesting to me, though, is that we don't use that same terminology across the board. So I hear that terminology a lot from women. And they're pretty quick to name that feeling when you walk into a room and you feel shy, bashful, maybe nervous to kind of put yourself out there or express an opinion or kind of reach out for an opportunity. And they name that as coming from imposter syndrome. In other circumstances, for a lot of men that we talk to, the terminology they use is, respect or nervousness or a little bit anxious. And it takes a little while for them to necessarily name, I'm anxious because I don't know that I have the right thing to say, or I'm anxious because I don't know that I am entitled to reach out for that investment or to cold call that investor. And on the investor side, the version of this often looks like I'm nervous that I'm not writing the right investments. I am concerned I'm actually not good enough for this thing that I'm reaching out to. At its core, imposter syndrome just is the belief that you're not yet or are not in total good enough for the thing that you are trying to do. And so we have different terminology for it, but it actually at its core is just a fear that you might not be good enough.
So let's talk about the impact of an investor that sees a startup founder working with an executive coach. Is it an asset? Do they see it as a good thing? Do they see it as an unnecessary expense? If it's pre-funding, if I'm a startup founder, should I wait until I go through a round of funding? Talk me through that process.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think increasingly, especially in the US, executive coaches are par for the course. In fact, the vast majority of the portfolios of the big funds all have executive coaches. For example, Felicis, a really big Bay Area fund, specifically requires that part of their investment goes to executive coaching. So it is actually a kind of open secret of the Valley that, as the name suggests, is still happening behind closed doors. So, for example, there's a wonderful book for any of your listeners that are looking to kind of understand the ubiquitousness of executive coaching called The $1 Trillion Coach. And it is a recognition that the former CEO of Intel, a guy called Bill Campbell, ended up becoming an executive coach. And he coached all of the founders and executive team at Google. He actually ran the executive team meeting for Google even after it listed. He coached Ben Horowitz. He coached most of the benchmark partners. He coached, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been a very common practice for many years now. So from my experience, talking to most of the investors I've interacted with, both with the CoLab hat on and the Co-Ventures hat, is it's seen as a wonderful investment for startup founders to make at the point that they start building the company around their product market fit. Prior to that, it can be a little bit of a expensive investment to be making very early when you're just focused on kind of operating your company and getting to that product market fit stage. And so I would say ubiquitously, it's seen as a valuable thing to do at the point that you're looking to make the transition from founder to CEO, and also looking to level up your executive team. Once you get to kind of Series B and later, I would say the vast majority of organizations already have an executive coach in and around the team to help capacitate the entire organization. One version of this I've seen that I think is a brilliant application of using an executive coach in your toolkit is often founder CEOs. This is the first time they have been in a senior leadership position. And part of that, when you are running a team, is actually coaching and training your team. And so they hire a full executive team of highly experienced, highly capable individuals. And then they bump into that maybe skill set gap of how they might be able to lead and train their team. And so they use an executive coach in partnership with them to help them keep their executives on a learning and development journey without them necessarily having to be the one to unlock that development in the team while they are still learning, while the CEO is still learning how they might be able to deliver that for their overall organization. So I would say, kind of in summary, it's a very normal investment for teams to be making around the kind of mid-seed through to Series B stage. I think if you lifted the hood on most portfolio companies or most of the big funds in America, and increasingly outside of America, you would see an executive coach somewhere around the organization.
From your executive coaching initiatives, and you've been an executive coach also, correct?
I have. Yes.
So let's just one specific actionable advice or strategy that a startup founder can use to enhance their leadership skills, foster team growth, something that you find yourself telling people time and time again that you think could give a little bit of a head start before they call you up at CoLab and ask you for like a full engagement.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think one of the most wonderful tools I have seen add enormous value to every team that has used it is what we call the breakfast machine, developed by a man called Andy Grove. So I hope you'll just entertain a small nerdy side marginalia here, but I promise I'll come back to the request. So Andy Grove, I want to give you the kind of background for him. He was the CEO of Intel. Prior to that, he was a physicist. He actually migrated from Hungary and went to Berkeley, and in the kind of true tradition of the Bay Area, built this incredible company and had this amazing impact on the entire ecosystem, even though he was not from America originally. So Andy Grove stepped into Intel and then started running it as the CEO. In his role as the CEO of Intel, he developed all of these frameworks and ways of thinking on how to run a tech company. He actually took the principles of manufacturing and was one of the first to apply them to knowledge work. So the production of an output where the features of the system that is producing that output are people thinking, not widgets being constructed on a manufacturing line. So he developed all of these frameworks around how best to run an organization where it is an organization of people. He also was a lecturer at Stanford Business School, and interestingly, coached and trained Bill Campbell, who then became his successor as the CEO of Intel. So Andy Grove developed this framework called the breakfast machine, and he popularized it in a book that I would recommend to all of your listeners called High Output Management. This is a wonderful resource if you're looking to scale yourself as a CEO and actually any executive in a fast-growing organization. So the breakfast machine, the mental model is think about a machine which its sole job is to produce a hot breakfast. And it has a bunch of different processes to produce that hot breakfast. Let's say we have an egg, we have a crispy bacon, we have a piece of toast and a hot coffee. Each of those processes takes a certain period of time to produce. Let's say it takes 1.5 minutes to toast, 3 minutes to produce an egg to the right level of runniness, 5 minutes to make a crunchy piece of bacon, and maybe you have drip coffee kind of ready in a pourer to go. And thinking about that system helps you identify, things get produced at a different period of time. All 4 of them have to be aligned and ready to go all at the same time. So I need to think about concepts like my rate limiting step, meaning the thing that is produced the slowest that I need to then align everything else to. It introduces concepts like, what do I need to see along the process to make sure that all of the systems are running on time? What Andy Grove calls his viewing window. Or what information do I need to be watching and observing the system to collect to make sure it's running healthily? How do I reduce waste in the system? What is my role in the system? Am I flipping the bacon, or am I standing back and watching the entire system run? And so starting to think about your organization through the lens of this breakfast machine and thinking about what are the systems that I've got in place, producing what output, timed when. What information do I need out of this system to know that it's running well? What do I need to be thinking about in terms of my role as the person that runs this system, as well as probably in the early days, flip some of the bacon, turn some of the toast, maybe pour some of the coffee? What are my mental models about how I scale out of this system over time? When I think about each of the systems that I have running, so for example, my engineering system, what are my predictions and estimates on who I need in seat as the organization scales, as it becomes more complex? The brilliance of this mental model is as your organization becomes more complex, you start to be able to do things like, my engineering system, I can also think of it as a standalone breakfast machine that is part of a series of other breakfast machines that all produce a very complex breakfast at the end. So this I find a really useful way to do the second tactical suggestion, which is every time you come to a part of your organization that isn't working optimally, ask yourself the question, system or operator? Usually, a lot of the adjustments we need to see in the organization, a lot of the challenges we're feeling in our organization come down to system, not operator. But because we are humans and we're used to operating in human systems, we are quick to assume it's the fault of the operator. And actually, as you scale from founder to CEO, your ability to operate and build the right system, as opposed to default to blaming the operator, is crucially important.
I'm just basking in that wisdom because I guess I would be a good CEO because I was on the leadership team at a podcast production company and management was constantly asking me, should we fire this person? Should we fire this person? They made a mistake. Should we fire this person? And all I focused on the entire time was processes. And we became scores more efficient. Money turned around, revenue went up. It was just all a whole thing. So anyway, I feel great about that.
Yeah, you should feel great about that. That's excellent. I mean, it's amazing what happens if you take this toolkit into everything that you do, right? We're talking here internally in the organization, but there's also, it's really valuable thinking externally, right? What is the system I have in place to acquire customers? Again, system or operator, right? Is the system, if I'm not getting the right customers, they're not willing to pay the right amount, or they're not kind of progressing through the funnel at the right pace, is it a system problem, or do I have the wrong people in that funnel? What does that then mean? It really distills down and clarifies some easy to solve levers or kind of adjust levers to continue to run experiments. So yeah, I find it a really useful tool to have in your toolkit for all executives and especially founders looking to make that development to CEO. And podcasters looking to make run a podcasting network.
I think production people typically, they know they need certain assets at certain times. I work with an editor on this podcast and there's certain things that you just do first, right? And sometimes I get a question, well, where's the marketing promotional material for the episode? Well, the episode's not done yet. So maybe we should focus on the episode getting done, right? So it's I think a lot of people in video, podcast production, CEOs, founders, look them up. Ask them a question. They might know. This is in the wheelhouse. Okay, so I know we're going a couple minutes long. I really appreciate all these great insights. So a couple more quick questions. One is that you've been involved in company building, angel investing, and venture funding. So just want to kind of pivot a little and ask, how has your firsthand experience as a founder and investor shaped your approach to supporting startups, and what lessons do you bring to your investments?
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing to highlight here is so much of instinct is earned by reps. And when you come to investing, when you come to supporting founders, I don't need to, I mean, this is an obvious thing to say, but things move really quickly. And so being able to rely on instinct because you've done the work to get the reps in those environments, I find really valuable. The second thing I would say, especially with my hat on as an investor, it's really valuable to know what it felt like to be on the other side of the table. Empathy actually is a very tough skill to develop. And if you've never experienced or truly stood in the other person's shoes, it can be intellectually a very tough ask to truly empathize with what that feels like. Intellectually understanding the cocktail of emotions you feel in a funding environment as a founder, for example, where it's a combination of excitement and terror and joy and, imposter syndrome and time constraints and all of those mixtures, intellectually understanding them, but actually having felt that in real life and what that does to the way that you make decisions, to the way that you move quickly, I find it to be really helpful. So I often anchor back in, reminding myself of what that experience was like. Co-Ventures, which I think I can say is a company to build, although it's a slightly different company style to be building, is now my 7th company. Only one of those has been venture-backed and the rest of them have all been bootstrapped. And so I've experienced many versions of building companies to varying levels of scale. And then I have the enormous privilege of partnering with executives from some of the fastest growing organizations in the world. And having partnered with them on that journey, I've seen many different reps of this version now. And so being able to pull from those insights as we are supporting the portfolio we work for, but also thinking about who might be the best executive coach on those development journeys, it's extremely valuable to be able to do our best work to support the founders that we work for with those various hats.
Amazing. One last quick question, since you mentioned it. So Collab operates across the US and Australia. There's no requirement for the coach or the coachee to be an Australian founder, but there is a requirement with your fund Co-Ventures. And the aim of Co-Ventures is to propel Australian founders to, I mentioned earlier in the show, building global companies. So I'm curious, as we wrap up, are there any specific challenges unique to the Australian startup ecosystem that you've encountered and you've helped address? Anything that would be helpful for a founder in that part of the world to know about before becoming an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Australian ecosystem, to give you some stats here, the Australian ecosystem has many of the features that kind of Tel Aviv had in 2016. So in terms of maturity of the ecosystem, depth of the ecosystem, it's fairly immature. So that has some implications like the number of angel investors, the number of funds, the kind of depth of the playbooks that have been delivered and developed as builders in the Australian ecosystem. So I think the first thing to say is, as an entrepreneur in the Australian ecosystem in particular, there is this huge opportunity to have an enormous impact on the actual ecosystem building. It also means there's all of this infrastructure that hasn't yet been built in the Australian ecosystem. So I would just kind of plant the seed. There are a lot of opportunities to watch what has been built in other ecosystems and explore building them in the Australian ecosystem. The kind of next thing I would say is with our Co-Ventures hat on, we invest in companies all over the world as long as one of the founders is Australian. So we actually, a good portion of our portfolio aren't in Australia. They are elsewhere in the world, majority of which are in the US. The thing I would say, kind of with that hat on, if you are an Australian anywhere in the world but grew up in Australia, Australia has fostered this kind of ethos of prioritizing hard work, prioritizing kind of a humbleness and just getting stuff done to show the work. And that can be incredibly valuable, especially in this macro market. So, doing the work to just show that the value is there, show that there is product market fit, and to kind of be humble as well as ambitious, that combination of things together, I think is really valuable. And then I think the last thing I would say for Australian founders kind of globally is increasingly there is this network of incredible Australians doing cool things internationally, which is what Co-Ventures is looking to activate and accelerate. So an example, we now have a whole bunch of unicorns that have been built out of Australia or with an Australian founder that aren't obviously Australian from the outside, right? Linktree, Canva, Atlassian, CultureAmp, Afterpay, and a whole bunch of others. They are all Australian unicorns. And a lot of them are based elsewhere in the world. And the network and community of those organizations are now starting to compound on them. So if you are an Australian somewhere in the world looking to build a cool company, I would encourage you to start and reach out to us.
Love that. And are there any particularly impactful companies you've worked with that you'd like to just bring our listeners' attention to before we wrap up?
Yeah. So there are obviously with executive coaching, there is a certain element of confidentiality to it. But what I can say is that the coaches in our network have all, or some of which have worked for the founders and executive teams of companies like Notion, Plaid, Segment, Linktree, and a whole bunch of others all around the world. So we are extremely experienced at working for founders and executive teams going through rapid scale. And our executive coaches are excellent at what they do. And we as an organization are extremely passionate about accelerating that next generation of founders looking to make the progression to world-class CEOs.
Maxine Minter is the founder and general partner of Co-Ventures, and you can hear her on her podcast, the co-host of a podcast about early-stage investing, First Check, CHEQUE, podcast featuring conversations with seasoned investors. So go check that out. You can learn more about Collab at thecollab.co. Maxine Minter is the founder and general partner of Co-Ventures, and you got to check out Collab for your executive coaching needs. Thank you so much for joining me today, Maxine. It was a blast.
Thanks so much for having me, Cody.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation, and I hope you've enjoyed all of my conversations. This is the 30th episode of The Funding Blueprint, Unlocking Startup Success. And I don't know about you, but I have learned a lot about what it takes to be a successful startup founder and how to get funded. This podcast may take a short break before Abraham starts releasing season 2. So wherever you're consuming this, Spotify, YouTube, whatever, hit the follow or subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode. And if you haven't already, then please tap the 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts to rate the show. You don't have to write anything, don't worry. It would just be nice to see some more ratings come in to acknowledge all the work that we've done on this show to educate you ad-free. If you know a founder or a business owner who would like to reach an audience via podcasting, then put them in touch with me. They can find me at cody@academicpodcasts.com. I have worked with B2B and B2C brands, big and small, to help them achieve their business objectives via audio. So from brand strategy to podcast production, you can count on me for anything audio, basically. And if you're looking for exceptional sound design or audio video production work, then get in touch with Sean Patel at seanpatel.com. Sean has edited all 30 episodes of The Funding Blueprint. He is the nicest guy ever. He's very easy to work with, and he has great taste in movies. I cannot speak highly enough of Sean. Go check out his website if you have not already. The Funding Blueprint was created and has been produced by me, Cody Goff, with audio and video editing by Sean Patel. Thanks again for joining me. Enjoy season 2 whenever it comes, and have a great week.